Welcome, ladies and gents, to the Ruibas channel. You've stumbled across an installment of Wacky World War II, which means you're in for another list of 10 wacky things that came out of the deadliest conflict in recorded human history. Our topic for this video is Wunderwaffe, which means wonder weapon or super weapon, and the term carries with it this connotation of something that has the capacity to fix any problem. It's the universal solution. With Hitler's influence, Nazi Germany had a keen interest in developing revolutionary and impressive weaponry with the purpose of bringing about victory both on the battlefield and in propaganda at home. The vast majority of these weapons basically only existed conceptually and never actually really were produced, so we'll cover that in another video, some of the best things that came out of that. This video is only going to cover things that actually were produced and used to some capacity in the war. So these were things that actually existed. So let's get to our 10 things and let's learn some wacky World War II. We're going to start off strong, and our first entry is the Karl-Gerat Supermortar. The Karl-Gerat was a massive 124-ton self-propelled 600mm mortar. 600mm meaning the diameter of the shells being fired was 60 centimeters or 23 inches. So for comparison, the standard 105mm howitzer that the US used as its artillery piece, it fired shells that were 105mm, about this wide. 600mm, something like this. These shells weighed up to 4,780 pounds, which is about 2.4 tons, which is more than a Ford F-150. It could launch these big shells up to a range of 2.5 miles, and it could launch smaller shells up to a range of 6.2 miles. At full speed, this beast could travel about 6 miles per hour, but it was accompanied by a crane that could disassemble the thing down into 7 more manageable loads, and then it could be transported a lot quicker. A total of 7 of these were actually constructed, and 6 of them indeed saw combat. Each of these mortars was accompanied not only by a crane, like we mentioned, but also 2 to 3 modified Panzer IV tanks, just so they could carry ammunition for the thing. Design for these weapons began in 1937, with production taking place from 1940 through 1942. They were in service up until 1945. One of these is actually currently on display in a tank museum in Moscow. Our next entry is the V3 cannon, another ludicrous artillery piece that was known as the London gun. Why was it called the London gun? Because it was designed so it could launch shells across the English Channel from mainland Europe at London. It had a range of 103 miles, which to my knowledge is like the largest stationary gun range of anything in World War II. It fired a 150mm shell that weighed 310 pounds. The design featured multi-propellant stages along the barrel that increased shell velocity. This was not a mobile artillery piece, and it had to be permanently built where it was going to be used, meaning you could only select a single target. Ever. That's why this was intended to target London, but it was rendered unusable from Allied bombing runs before it could be completed. However, there were 2 other similar models that were produced and were in fact used to bombard Luxembourg towards the end of the war. Our next Wunderwaffe is the final artillery piece that's on the list, the Schwerer Gustav. The Schwerer Gustav was a railway gun, and Germany had several of these types of guns, and Britain had their own as well, but the largest seen in World War II was the Gustav. So remember that 600mm shell we talked about for the Karl Supermortar thing? This thing fired 800mm shells. They were that wide. These shells weighed almost 8 tons, meaning the Gustav could essentially fire a D-Day landing craft at a range of 29 miles. It also had a fire rate of 1 round every 30 to 45 minutes. This gun was so massive that it actually required 2 sets of parallel reinforced tracks in order to move. It operated along a curved track, which served as the gun's means of changing where it would fire, with the gun itself only being able to move up and down in order to change elevation. That's enough about massive pieces of artillery. Let's scale it down to a man-portable weapon called the Fliegerfaust. The Fliegerfaust was a shoulder-fired anti-aircraft prototype that fired 20mm unguided missiles. The first variant was fitted with only 4 barrels, but a second variant added 5 more for a total of 9. When used, the first 4 barrels would fire all of the rockets simultaneously, and then a fraction of a second later, the other 5 would fire. This meant that you had 9 rockets flying into the air within the span of half a second. The timing and barrel spacing was intended to avoid mutual interference in the rockets' flight paths. Unfortunately, the weapons did not prove super useful, as they had a much more limited range than what you need for anti-aircraft fire, and the rockets would just kind of disperse really quickly and didn't work out. For our number 5, we have the FL-282 Kolibri, one of the world's first, if not the first, successful helicopters. When we think of helicopters, we don't usually picture World War II, but Germany was testing this specific model in 1941 and it entered service in 1942. The Kolibri didn't have a tail rotor to stabilize flight, but it had an intermeshing rotor design where the two main rotors are set at angles against each other and they just sort of rotate in harmony, kind of like some of the World War II fighters that actually had their machine guns integrated so that they would fire in between the propeller blades of the front of the plane. This primitive helicopter actually performed quite well and 1,000 units were ordered, but the factory making them was destroyed after only producing 24, so they didn't get a whole fleet like they were hoping. They were used primarily for recon, light transport, and artillery spotting, but towards the end of the war, they were just gradually picked off by the Soviets. Sorry. Our number 6 is an aircraft that was just a tad bit bigger than the Kolibri, and that is the Wunderwaffe BV-238. The BV-238 was a flying boat, meaning it could land and take off from water. When it first flew in 1944, it was the heaviest aircraft ever built, weighing in at 100 tons when fully loaded. The BV-238 was an impressive plane, to be sure, but it didn't have much of a history. Only one functional plane was built, but it didn't really see service and was strafed and sunk by a squadron of P-51s shortly before the war ended. But it did exist and it did fly. We have another weapon of the sky for our number 7, but it's not exactly an aircraft. Let's look at the V-1 flying bomb. The V-1 is fairly recognizable as a World War II weapon, and it was one of the world's first operational cruise missiles. These weapons were massive 2-ton flying bombs that were designed to just start smashing Britain. They had an operational range of 160 miles and were fired at England from launch sites along the French and Dutch coasts. While most Wunderwaffe didn't actually see much action in the war, even the ones that were produced, the V-1s were used heavily, and almost 10,000 of them were launched at Britain in the late stages of the war. I had trouble understanding the science of how these things actually worked, but they basically had a very primitive autopilot that would guide them to their assigned target, and by the end of the war, they would strike targets to an accuracy of within 7 miles. I know that doesn't sound super great, but when you're launching something like across the English Channel, you're not necessarily trying to hit a specific building, you're just trying to get as much death and destruction across the water and into Britain as possible. A fun and unique aspect of the war is that since these missiles weren't particularly quick moving compared to modern missiles, British fighters could actually intercept them if they had enough time, fly up next to them, put their wingtip up against the bomb, and then spin and push the bomb off course. This would upset the guidance and the stabilization of the V-1s, and then they would just spiral out of control, explode, do something other than hitting the intended target. For our number 8, we have the sequel to the V-1, the V-2 rocket. While the V-1 was the world's first cruise missile, the V-2 was the world's first guided ballistic missile. The V-2s were used in smaller numbers than the V-1s, but they were much more terrifying. So V-1 flying bombs, they flew underneath the speed of sound, so you could hear them coming. I mean, maybe that doesn't do much for you. It's not like you can get out of the way super quick, but at least you could hear them coming. But the V-2s approached at Mach 2, meaning you literally could not hear them coming. They carried a 1-ton payload and it caused devastation at its impact point. Despite all of this, the V-2 isn't considered to be much of a success. They were extremely expensive to produce and had a large failure rate, with the tendency to airburst upon re-entry before even striking the target. Nevertheless, the V-2 was an impressive advancement in rocket technology, and it was quite feared despite its failures. We're getting close to the end, which means we need to talk about the Panzer VIII Maus. The Maus was a super heavy tank, which is fun to say, and it dwarfed the Tiger II considerably. Its main armament was a 128mm gun that was strong enough to destroy any Allied fighting vehicle at the time. If that wasn't enough, it had an additional 75mm gun, which is basically what Sherman tanks had, attached coaxially to the same turret. Its armor was as thick as 9 inches in the front, meaning a Sherman's shells would just bounce right off of it. While this vehicle was menacing, only 2 prototypes were ever produced, and it's quite unlikely that they saw any sort of combat at all. I personally don't think that the Maus looked quite as cool as the Tiger I or Tiger II. It was just kind of boxy, but at the same time, I don't think that's what the Germans had in mind while they were designing it. For our number 10, we have a bit of an odd entry here. I don't know if you can really call this thing a wonder weapon necessarily, but it is definitely a wonder. The Kugelpanzer, or the ball tank. This little guy actually remains a bit of a mystery to this day. No one knows really anything about it other than that it's a German-made tank. One of them was exported to Japan. It was powered by a motorcycle engine, and it's crewed by just a single person. It's believed that it was probably a light reconnaissance vehicle that provided minor protection for the driver, but that's about as much as we can infer from it, other than it looks cool. I like to imagine that this was invented by one of the guys who had to invade Poland on a bike, and he was thinking like, If only we had a cooler way to do this. What if we had an armored ball that we could roll around in instead? And that concludes today's foray into the wacky happenings of World War II. Thank you guys for watching. Consider liking if you found this useful, and do the whole subscribe thing if you'd like to see more wacky World War II videos in the future. I'll see you guys in the next video. Ruiboss out.